The Grethari hit the bay doors at speed. Dr. Sulek Wren heard the proximity alarm 3 seconds before the crash, which was enough time to drop the bone clamp she was holding, and not enough time to do anything useful with her hands. The impact shook the entire triage wing of the Velun Orbital Veterinary Station, a rolling concussion that traveled through the floor plates and up through Sulek's hind legs, and settled in her thoracic cavity like a second heartbeat made of metal and panic. The overhead lights flickered. 2 surgical trays hit the floor. A containment unit in Bay 4 cracked its seal and began venting coolant mist into the corridor. Then the screaming started. Not the Grethari didn't scream. It was the staff. 16 veterinary technicians, 4 surgical specialists, 2 xenobiological consultants, and an administrative coordinator, who had been carrying a tray of sterilized instruments across the main corridor, when 800 kilograms of apex predator punched through the emergency receiving hatch and skidded across the triage floor trailing blood, and a cargo net that had been shredded to fiber. Sulek was through the door before the alarm cycled its second pulse. She was Telvari, tall, blue-gray, built narrow, her secondary forearms already reaching for the emergency kit mounted inside the corridor wall. 14 years of xenoveterinary trauma work on Velun, and she had never seen a live Grethari. Nobody at the station had. Grethari were Class 9 apex predators from Chelmvor, a high-gravity deathworld that the Concord Xenobiological Registry had classified under exclusion-grade megafauna. The species had been studied exactly twice in controlled settings. Both studies ended when the containment failed. The published literature was 3 pages long, half of it redacted, and the final line of the species summary read, "Direct veterinary intervention is not recommended under any operational framework." This one was dying. It lay on the triage floor in a spreading pool of dark fluid that Sulek's training identified as arterial equivalent before her conscious mind finished processing the scene. The Grethari was enormous, longer than the surgical table, broader than the bay door it had come through, its body covered in dense plating that looked like stone but flexed with each labored breath. 6 limbs, the forward pair ending in manipulator claws that could shear hull plating, now curled inward against its chest. Its head was a wedge of armored bone with deep-set eyes that glowed a fading amber. A ridge of sensory spines ran from its skull to the base of its tail, pulsing erratically, the biological equivalent of a distress beacon. The blood was coming from its flank, a ragged wound the width of Sulek's torso, deep enough to show the layered muscle beneath the dermal plating, the kind made by industrial machinery or a predator larger than itself. The edges were already inflamed, the tissue swelling with a speed that told Sulek the Grethari's immune response was catastrophically overreacting, turning its own body into a trap. "Clear the bay," Sulek said. Her voice came out steady. She did not feel steady. "Keth, get me a hemostatic field generator rated for Class 7 or above. Tanev, pull the broad-spectrum anti-inflammatory kit. Ro, I need imaging portable because we are not moving this animal." Nobody moved. They were staring at the Grethari. 16 staff members pressed against the corridor walls, some behind instrument carts. The administrative coordinator had dropped his tray and was standing in a scatter of sterilized clamps with his chromatophores cycling through colors that meant pure, unprocessed terror. "Now," Sulek said. Keth moved first. The junior tech was D-Ven, compact, armored-plated and young enough that training overrode instinct. She ran for the equipment bay. Tanev followed. Ro fumbled with the portable imaging unit, hands shaking so badly the calibration screen scrolled through 3 menus before she found the right one. The Grethari's eyes tracked the movement. Not aggressively, this was an animal in pain, in a place it didn't recognize, watching for any sign that the next thing to happen would make the pain worse. Its breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, the rhythm stuttering every 4th cycle. Shock. The armor plating, the evolutionary defense that had kept the species alive on a world that killed everything below Class 6, was now working against it, restricting chest expansion. In a healthy animal, the musculature compensated. In an animal bleeding out on a triage floor, the plating was suffocating it. "I need to get to the wound," Sulek said. She took a step toward the Grethari. The Grethari's forward claws uncurled. Not all the way, the movement was weak, sluggish, but enough that the tips scraped the floor plating with a sound that emptied the corridor behind Sulek of every staff member who had started to come back. Dr. Keth was beside her, hemostatic generator in her arms, voice carefully level. The literature says don't. I read it. The literature was written by researchers who never had a dying one on their floor. Sulek studied the animal. Its eyes had not left her. The sensory spines along its back were pulsing in a pattern she didn't recognize, not the distress pattern from the files, not aggression, not territorial display, something else. It came here. It crashed here. Grethari don't crash. They're rated for atmospheric re-entry on worlds with twice this station's gravity. This animal navigated a debris field, matched velocity with a rotating station, and hit the receiving bay. It didn't crash. It arrived. It's a wild animal in a medical facility, protocol says. Protocol says sedate and contain. Tell me what sedative works on a Class 9 apex predator from a deathworld we've studied twice, both times unsuccessfully. Go ahead. I'll wait. Keth didn't answer, because there wasn't one. The Concord's pharmaceutical database had exactly 0 approved sedation protocols for Grethari. The species metabolized chemical agents faster than they could be administered, a biological defense against the venomous flora of Chelmvor. The 2 research teams that had attempted sedation had managed to make the animals angry. That was the redacted part of the literature. Security is on their way, Tanev reported from the monitoring station, her voice thin through the intercom. Station director wants to know if he should authorize lethal countermeasures. Tell the station director that if anyone enters this bay with a weapon, I will file an obstruction of treatment complaint that will follow their career across 6 systems. Sulek didn't take her eyes off the Grethari. This is a veterinary emergency, not a security incident. Doctor, it sheared through a reinforced hatch. She sheared through a reinforced hatch because the hatch was between her and the only facility in 3 sectors with a trauma bay. Animals don't come to places that hurt them. They come to places that might help. The Grethari's breathing hitched. A low sound escaped its throat, not a growl, not a roar. A vibration that Sulek felt in her teeth and her sternum. Pain. Raw, unfiltered pain from an animal that had no frame of reference for help, and was lying in a pool of its own blood waiting for the next thing to hurt. Sulek set down the emergency kit. She crouched. She made herself small. Dim the overheads by 40%. The sensory spines are photosensitive. We're cooking them under surgical floods. And someone turn off that alarm. The lights dropped. The alarm cut. The corridor went from crisis bright to something that approximated the filtered light of a heavy canopy forest, and the Grethari's sensory spines slowed their pulsing by half. The amber glow in its eyes steadied, fractionally. Tanev, what's the imaging showing? 3 layers of dermal plating breached. Subcutaneous vasculature compromised, at least 4 arterial analogs severed. The inflammatory response is accelerating. I'm reading tissue necrotization at the wound margins already. Rate. At current progression, the necrosis will reach the primary lymphatic analog in approximately 22 minutes. After that, systemic sepsis. The animal's own immune system will kill it faster than the blood loss. 22 minutes. Sulek had 22 minutes to approach, assess, and begin treatment on an animal that no veterinarian in the Concord's history had successfully touched while it was conscious. She waited, 1 minute, 2, the Grethari watched her. She watched the Grethari. This one was telling her the same thing they all told her. I don't know if you're going to hurt me. I don't have the energy to stop you if you try. She was preparing her approach when the corridor door opened, and a human walked in. The human was female, late 30s, brown hair pulled back with a band that was losing its grip, wearing a civilian maintenance jumpsuit with the Velun Station patch on the left shoulder and a smear of lubricant on the right sleeve. She was not tall. She was not imposing. She looked like someone who fixed conduit junctions and didn't think about it very hard. She was carrying a cat. Not carrying it. The cat was draped across her left forearm with the boneless ease of an animal that had been carried in exactly that position 10,000 times and had long since stopped having opinions about it. It was a tabby, brown and black and copper stripes, medium-sized, ears forward, green eyes open, tail hanging straight down with the tip curled slightly upward. It looked mildly interested in everything and deeply committed to nothing. Sorry, the human said. She didn't seem alarmed by the 800-kilogram apex predator bleeding on the floor. She seemed like someone who had walked into the wrong room and was trying to be polite about it. Maintenance sent me for the coolant leak in Bay 4. I can come back. Sulek stared at her. The Grethari stared at the cat. The cat yawned. You need to leave, Sulek said. This bay is under emergency quarantine. There's a Class 9 predator. I can see that. The human glanced at the Grethari the way someone glances at a large piece of equipment blocking a corridor. Assessment, not alarm. Is it hurt? She is critically injured and we cannot approach her. Please take your animal and... The cat jumped down. It dropped from the human's arm to the triage floor with the silent, self-assured precision of a creature that had been jumping off of things since before the conquered existed as a concept. It landed, sat, and began washing its left paw. 3 meters from the Grethari. Keth made a sound that Sulek had never heard a Divan make before. It was the sound of someone whose threat assessment framework had just been handed a scenario it was not built to process. Your animal, Sulek started. He's fine. The human said it the way someone says the sky is up. She didn't move to retrieve the cat. She didn't tense. She watched the cat wash its paw with the mild, distracted attention of someone who had seen this particular cat wash this particular paw in 1,000 different rooms, and she did not appear to consider the presence of a dying apex predator a relevant variable. The Grethari's head moved. The movement was slow, the animal was weakening, its blood loss passing the threshold where everything became deliberate and expensive, but it tracked with a precision that Sulek recognized. Not hunting, not threat assessment, recognition. The Grethari's sensory spines oriented toward the cat, all of them, a full array locking onto a target that registered not as food, not as threat, but as something the animal's deep predatory architecture recognized on a level below conscious processing. Apex to apex. The cat finished washing its paw. It looked up at the Grethari with the particular expression that housecats reserve for things that are larger than them and less interesting than they expected. Then it stood, stretched, front legs extended, back arched, every vertebra articulating in a slow, luxurious wave, and walked toward the Grethari. Stop that animal, Keth said. The human shook her head once, not an order, not a command, a statement of confidence. She trusted the cat. The trust was absolute, reflexive, built on a history that Sulek couldn't see but could read in the human's posture like a medical chart. The cat walked across the triage floor, past the blood pool, stepping over it, not through it, with the fastidious precision of an animal that did not like getting its feet wet, and stopped beside the Grethari's head. The Grethari's forward claws were still half extended. Each claw was longer than the cat's entire body. The cat appeared to find this unremarkable. It sat down, 6 inches from the Grethari's jaw. The Grethari's sensory spine stopped pulsing. All of them, the entire ridge from skull to tail, which had been cycling through distress and pain and confusion since the animal hit the bay doors, went still. The amber glow in its eyes shifted, not brighter, not dimmer, but warmer. A frequency change that Sulek's instruments would later confirm corresponded to a measurable drop in cortisol equivalent and a surge in oxytocin analog. The Grethari was looking at the cat the way the cat was looking at the Grethari. Calm, steady, patient. The cat began to purr. The sound was small, a domestic motor idling in a chest the size of a loaf of bread, a vibration so quiet that Sulek wouldn't have heard it if the corridor hadn't gone silent. But the Grethari heard it. The Grethari heard it with its entire body. The sensory spines, the chemical receptors along its jaw ridge, the subdermal pressure sensors that let a Class 9 predator track prey through solid rock, all of them oriented toward the sound and read it. Not as a threat, not as prey distress, as something the Grethari had never encountered in the wild and recognized anyway, the way a tuning fork recognizes its own frequency in a room full of noise. The Grethari's forward claws retracted, fully, the first time since it had arrived. The manipulator digits folded inward with a hydraulic smoothness that made Keth step back and Sulek step forward. "Doctor," quiet Sulek said. She was watching the Grethari's breathing. It had changed. The shallow, panicked rhythm was slowing, deepening, the chest plates expanding further with each cycle. The animal was calming down. Not sedated, calm. Voluntarily calm, its autonomic systems responding to a stimulus that no pharmaceutical in the Concord's database could replicate. A cat purring on a triage floor. The human moved. She walked toward the Grethari, not quickly, not slowly, the pace of someone crossing a kitchen to check a pot on the stove. She knelt beside the cat. Her hand rested on the cat's back, between the shoulder blades, a casual touch that the cat acknowledged with a fractional increase in per volume, and the Grethari acknowledged by tilting its massive head 3 degrees toward the human's face. "Hey," the human said. She was talking to the Grethari. Her voice was the same flat, unremarkable register she'd used with Sulek. No alarm, no special calm the animal modulation, just a person talking. "You're having a rough day." The Grethari exhaled. The breath washed over the human and the cat, carrying heat and the copper iron smell of alien blood, and something underneath it that Sulek's training told her was endorphin release. The chemical signature of an animal whose pain was still present but whose fear was leaving. "I need to see that wound," Sulek said. She didn't know why she was talking to the human. The human wasn't a veterinarian. The human wasn't a handler. The human was a maintenance technician with a cat. But the human was kneeling beside a Class 9 apex predator, and the apex predator had retracted its claws. And Sulek had been in xenoveterinary medicine long enough to know that you don't question what's working. "Then come look at it," the human said. Sulek approached. She kept her movements slow, her hands visible, her body low. Everything the manual said, everything the training prescribed, except the manual hadn't accounted for the cat, which was purring at a steady 28 Hz, a frequency that Sulek's instruments would later show matched the Grethari's resting cardiopulmonary rhythm within a 2% margin. The cat was not doing anything remarkable. It was sitting beside a dying animal and making the sound that cats make. The remarkable thing was that the dying animal had listened. She reached the Grethari's flank. The wound was worse up close. The tissue damage extended deeper than the external presentation suggested, and the immune hyperreaction had begun necrotizing the wound margins. If Sulek didn't intervene in the next few minutes, the Grethari's own defense systems would seal the wound around the infection, and the animal would die of systemic sepsis within hours. "Keth, the hemostatic field, now. And the anti-inflammatory, I need the broad spectrum, not the targeted. We don't have a metabolic profile for this species, and I'm not guessing." Keth brought the equipment. She moved the way all good techs move in the presence of a dangerous animal, slow, quiet, each piece of equipment set down rather than placed, each motion telegraphed. She kept her eyes on the Grethari's claws. The claws stayed retracted. The cat was still purring. Sulek activated the hemostatic field. It was designed for Class 7 wounds at maximum. The Grethari's physiology was 2 classes above its rating, but it would slow the bleeding enough to buy her time. The field hummed to life, a blue-white shimmer across the wound surface, and the Grethari flinched. A whole-body twitch, 800 kilograms of muscle contracting against unfamiliar stimulation. Its claws began to extend. The human put her hand on the Grethari's foreleg. She didn't push. She didn't grip. She laid her palm flat against the armor, plating the way someone lays a hand on a kitchen table, without agenda, without urgency, a point of contact that said nothing except "I'm here." The claws stopped, half extended. The Grethari's eyes moved to the human. The human looked back. "It's okay," she said, the same flat voice. "They're trying to help." The claws retracted. Sulek worked. She worked faster than she had ever worked, and more carefully, and with a precision that she would later attribute to the absolute stillness of the room. No one spoke. No one moved except Sulek and Keth, passing instruments back and forth in a rhythm that 14 years of partnership had made automatic. Tanev monitored from the imaging unit, feeding Sulek data on tissue density, inflammatory markers, and the Grethari's cardiovascular output in real time. Rowe documented everything. The wound was a nightmare. 3 layers of dermal plating breached, the underlying vasculature compromised, and the infection already in the primary lymphatic analog. Sulek debrided necrotic tissue, deployed antimicrobial barriers, and sutured damaged vessels with a microwelder recalibrated twice because it wasn't designed for plating this dense. The Grethari's blood clotted in stages, each layer harder than the last, excellent biology and terrible for surgery. Every suture she placed had to fight through a matrix that hardened as she worked. Midway through, the station security team arrived. 4 armed Gren officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, pressing against the observation window. Their squad leader, a broad-shouldered officer named Derek, keyed the intercom. "Dr. Wren, we have authorization to neutralize the animal." "You have authorization to stand in that corridor and watch," Sulek said without looking up from the wound. "This animal is under my medical authority. If a weapon crosses this threshold, I will have the station commander revoke your department's access to the entire medical wing. The animal is Class 9. The animal is my patient. She's also lying still while I operate on her, which is more cooperation than I've gotten from most of your Class 2 detainees." Silence from the intercom. Derek didn't leave, but the weapons lowered a fraction. The Grethari didn't move. For 47 minutes, 800 kilograms of Class 9 apex predator lay on a triage floor while an alien veterinarian worked inside its body, and it didn't move. Its eyes stayed on the human. The human's hand stayed on its foreleg. The cat stayed beside its head, purring. At minute 32, the Grethari's tail moved. It shifted from its resting position against the floor and curled slowly around the back of the human's legs, not restraining, enclosing, the way a parent animal wraps a limb around an offspring, the way a pack animal brings a new member inside the perimeter. The human didn't flinch. She glanced down at the tail, the same way she might glance at a jacket draped across her lap, and went back to watching the Grethari's face. At minute 41, one of the security officers outside the window lowered his weapon entirely. Then another. By the time Sulek sealed the final suture, all 4 weapons were holstered, and Derek was leaning against the corridor wall with an expression that Sulek recognized from her first year in veterinary school. The face of someone whose understanding of a species had just been rewritten in real time. Sulek deployed the broad-spectrum anti-inflammatory into the wound margins, then covered the site with a biosynthetic patch that would monitor healing and alert her if the infection broke through. She stood, her secondary forearms aching, her primary arms shaking, and looked at the Grethari. Its breathing was deep, regular. The sensory spines had resumed their pulsing, not the erratic distress pattern but a slow, steady rhythm. Rest. The Grethari was resting on a triage floor surrounded by alien species because a cat was purring beside its head and a human was sitting with her hand on its leg. "What is your name?" Sulek asked the human. She realized she hadn't asked. She had treated a Class 9 apex predator for 47 minutes with an unregistered human civilian kneeling beside the patient, and she hadn't asked the woman's name. "Marit Cohen, maintenance Searing, the cat is Soot." "Soot. He showed up at the loading dock 4 years ago. I put out a plate. He stayed." Sulek looked at Soot. Soot was grooming the fur between his toes with the methodical focus of an animal whose priorities had been thoroughly established and did not include the concerns of the surrounding medical staff. "Ms. Cohen, the animal you are touching has been classified by the Concord Xenobiological Registry as one of the most dangerous species ever catalogued. No handler in recorded history has achieved voluntary physical contact with a Grethari specimen. You put your hand on it." Marit looked at her hand on the Grethari's foreleg. The armor plating under her palm was warm, dense, and she could feel the slow pulse of the animal's circulatory system through it. She was scared. Scared animals need to know someone's there. That is a veterinary assessment. That's common sense. I grew up on a farm. We had a dairy cow that would kick anyone who tried to milk her unless you put your hand on her shoulder first. Different animal, same principle. Sulek had no response to this. 14 years of field experience and no response to a maintenance technician comparing a Class 9 apex predator to a dairy cow. She turned to Keth. "Set up a monitoring perimeter. I want continuous vitals on the Grethari, heart rate, respiration, inflammatory markers, immunological response. Full telemetry, 30-second intervals. And notify the station administration that Bay 3 is now a long-term treatment suite. We're not moving this animal until she's stable." "How long will that take?" "As long as it takes." "What about the human and the cat?" Sulek looked at Marit. Marit was scratching the Grethari behind the armor ridge above its left eye. The Grethari had closed its eyes. Its sensory spines were pulsing in a rhythm that Sulek's instruments had never recorded for the species. Slow, even, deep. Contentment. The instruments were reading contentment from a Class 9 apex predator, and the cause was a maintenance worker scratching behind its ear. They stay. The rest of the first day was triage in slow motion. Sulek ran blood panels using a Chelmsford cross-reference database compiled from the 2 failed research studies. The panels came back with numbers that no framework could contextualize: metabolic rates 4 times Telvari baseline, white cell analogs she'd never seen in any species, and a healing cascade already attempting to close the wound despite the ongoing infection. The Grethari's body was fighting on 2 fronts: its own immune system and the injury, and winning on both through sheer biological stubbornness. "The tissue regeneration rate is remarkable," Tanev said, reviewing the scans from the monitoring station. "If this holds, the wound will begin closing within 72 hours. If the immune hyperreaction doesn't kill her first," Sulek said. "The regeneration is accelerating the inflammatory response. The faster she heals, the harder her body fights the process. A deathworld paradox. A deathworld problem. The biology evolved to survive wounds that would kill anything else. It didn't evolve for someone trying to help." Marit, who had been listening from her position beside the Grethari, said, "Sounds like most animals I've known." Sulek looked at her. The human had been sitting in the same position for 3 hours, cross-legged, one hand on the Grethari's foreleg, the other on Soot's back. No fatigue, no impatience. Sulek had worked with professional handlers who couldn't maintain that kind of presence for 30 minutes. "How long can you stay?" Sulek asked. "As long as she needs." Derek, the security squad leader, appeared at the observation window again at 1800. This time he came alone. No weapon drawn. He stood at the glass for 10 minutes, watching Merritt scratch the Grethari's jaw ridge while Soot slept on the animal's claw, and then he keyed the intercom. "Dr. Wren." "Officer. My report to the station commander will note that the animal showed no aggressive behavior during the treatment period, and that the human civilian's presence appeared to have a stabilizing effect." He paused. "I've been in security for 22 years. I've never filed a report like that about a Class 9. "Neither have I." "Is she going to make it?" Sulek looked at the telemetry, heart rate steady, respiration normalizing. "The wound patch still green. Ask me in the morning." The first night was the worst. The Grethari's immune system mounted a secondary response at 300 station time, a fever spike that sent its core temperature 12 degrees above baseline and triggered a cascade of inflammatory markers that turned the biosynthetic patch from green to red in 90 seconds. Sulek was in the triage bay within 4 minutes. Keth was already there, prepping the emergency antipyretic protocol they'd assembled from 3 different species frameworks because no single one applied. The Grethari was awake. Its eyes burned amber in the dim light, and its claws were half extended, scraping the floor plates in slow, rhythmic arcs. Pain. The fever was pressing against the inside of its armor plating, and Sulek realized with a cold understanding that the plating had no way to vent excess heat. On Chelmvor, the species regulated temperature through environmental submersion, forest pools, underground rivers. Here, on a station with recycled air and climate control set for Telvari comfort, the Grethari was cooking inside its own defenses. "Drop ambient temperature 15 degrees, Sulek ordered, "and get me water, not synthesized, pull it from the station's reserve, real water as cold as the system allows." "Doctor, the station water reserve is for emergencies." "This is an emergency." They rigged a circulation system in 18 minutes, Keth and Tanev working together, connecting a portable cooling unit to a drainage tray positioned against the Grethari's flank. Cold water ran across the armor plating in a thin, steady sheet. The Grethari's sensory spines responded immediately, orienting toward the water, reading its temperature, its chemical composition, its movement. The spines pulsed faster for 3 seconds recognition, and then slower, much slower. The water was registering as something the animal's biology understood, but the fever was still climbing. Merritt was already there. She had slept on the triage floor. Sulek would learn this from the monitoring logs later, curled against the wall with soot on her chest and a maintenance blanket pulled up to her chin. When the Grethari's temperature spiked, she was on her feet before the alarm finished its first cycle. Soot was on her shoulder, ears forward, green eyes tracking the room with the calm assessment of an animal that had decided sleep was over and work had begun. Merritt knelt beside the Grethari's head. Her hand found the same spot on the foreleg, the same flat-palmed contact that asked nothing and offered nothing except presence. "I know," she said. "I know it hurts. Stay with me." The Grethari's claws retracted. Not immediately. The animal was fighting through pain, its nervous system firing distress signals that overwhelmed its voluntary control. But degree by degree, millimeter by millimeter, the claws pulled inward. Its eyes found Merritt's face. Held. Sulek administered the antipyretic. 3 species frameworks blended into a dosage she'd estimated from 6 hours of telemetry, and 3 pages of literature everyone agreed were probably incomplete. She injected it through the wound site, the only place where the dermal plating was breached. The Grethari didn't flinch. Sulek had her hands inside a wound on a Class 9 predator in acute fever distress, and the animal held still because a human was touching its leg and talking to it, and a cat was sitting beside its head, making a sound like a small engine running on trust. The fever broke at 340. The temperature dropped in stages, the inflammatory cascade reversing as the antipyretic reached the Grethari's lymphatic analog and began suppressing the overreaction. By 400, the animal's vitals had stabilized. By 430, it was asleep. Merritt's hand was still on its foreleg. She'd fallen asleep too, her back against the Grethari's flank, her head tilted sideways. Soot was between them, curled in the space where the Grethari's neck met its shoulder, his body wedged against the armor plating, purring. Sulek stood in the monitoring station and watched the telemetry feed. Heart rate 22 BPM, respiration 8 per minute, cortisol equivalent 14% of admission baseline, oxytocin analog 340% of species recorded maximum. The literature's single documented instance of elevated oxytocin in a Grethari, 9 seconds of pre-attack chemistry from the second research team, was 1/4 of what Sulek was reading now, sustained, in an animal asleep with a cat on its shoulder and a human against its side. She began writing a report. She stopped, started again, stopped again. She did not know what framework to write it in because no framework she'd been trained in accounted for what she was watching. Keth came in with 2 cups of thermal broth. She set one beside Sulek and drank the other standing up, watching the same feed. "The human's cat," Keth said. "Does it have any training?" "It's a cat." "Does that mean no?" "It means it's a cat, Earth domestic feline. It does what it does because it chooses to, not because anyone trained it. The human didn't tell it to walk toward the Grethari. It decided." Keth processed this. The most dangerous animal in our bay was calmed by an animal that made its own decision to help. That appears to be the case. And the human. The human grew up on a farm and thinks an 800-kilogram apex predator from a deathworld responds to the same principles as a dairy cow. Does it? Sulek looked at the feed. The Grethari was sleeping. Its vitals were the most stable readings ever recorded for the species. Its claws had been retracted for 6 consecutive hours, and a tabby cat was purring against its neck while a human maintenance technician snored against its ribs. Apparently, Sulek drank her broth and began writing the report again. This time she didn't stop. She wrote for 2 hours, documenting every observation, every telemetry reading, every moment she had witnessed between the human, the cat, and the Grethari. When she reached the section on the cat's effect on the Grethari's neurochemistry, she paused and wrote a single sentence that she would later recognize as the pivot point of her career. The Earth domestic feline is not a tool. It is not an instrument. It is a participant, a voluntary, autonomous participant whose decision to approach the patient initiated a neurochemical cascade that 14 years of xenoveterinary training could not replicate, and every approved protocol would have prevented. She saved the draft and closed her tablet. On the monitoring feed, the Grethari slept. Merritt slept. Soot purred. Sulek did not sleep. She sat in the monitoring station and watched the numbers hold steady through the night, and she thought about what it meant that the most dangerous animal she had ever treated had been calmed by the 2 things the Concord's protocols would have removed first: the unauthorized human and the unregistered cat. The second day brought complications. The third day brought the Concord. At 600 on day 2, the Grethari's wound showed signs of secondary infection, a resistant strain that the broad-spectrum antimicrobials hadn't touched. The biosynthetic patch cycled from green to amber, and the tissue around the wound margins began swelling again. Sulek recalibrated her approach, deploying a targeted antimicrobial derived from Chelmvor atmospheric data. A guess, informed by everything she knew about deathworld biology and nothing she could confirm. If the guess was wrong, the infection would advance into the Grethari's core lymphatic system within 6 hours, and no intervention would save it. She told Merritt this, not because Merritt was medical staff, but because Merritt was the only person in the bay whose presence the Grethari tolerated during treatment. And Sulek had learned in 2 days that the honest thing and the effective thing were the same thing when you were dealing with humans. Merritt listened, nodded, and said, "Then we'd better get it right." Sulek debrided the infected tissue at the wound margins, while Merritt held the Grethari's foreleg, and Soot sat on the Grethari's shoulder blade, grooming himself with the intense focus of an animal who understood that his job was to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing and nothing else. The Grethari watched Sulek work with amber eyes that tracked every instrument, every movement, every breath. Its claws stayed retracted. Its sensory spines pulsed in the slow, even rhythm that Sulek had come to think of as Soot's frequency. The targeted antimicrobial worked. By evening, the patch was green again. The infection had retreated. Sulek didn't celebrate. She ordered a second round of monitoring and sat in the observation station until 200, watching the telemetry for any sign of relapse. There was none. On the morning of day 3, a fast courier docked carrying a 3-member assessment team from the Xenobiological Oversight Committee. Sulek met them in the administrative corridor, because she did not want them in the triage bay, and she wanted to explain why before they tried to override her. The assessment lead was a Seth named Counselor Jorath, translucent skin, gravel voice, the kind of functionary who made decisions based on liability projections and filed the ethics afterward. His colleagues were a Gren containment specialist named Havo and a Hask data analyst with 4 eyes, and a tablet that she never stopped scrolling. "You're treating it," Jorath said. "It was not a question." "She's my patient." A Class 9 apex predator from an exclusion-grade world is your patient. She arrived in my triage bay with a life-threatening wound. I treated her. She's responding. Under what protocol? Sulek didn't blink. Telvari had 3 eyelids and she held all of them open. A new one. Jorath's vascular patterns rippled skepticism, rendered invisible blood flow. "Show me." They walked to the triage bay. Sulek entered first, keeping Jorath behind her. Through the observation window, the bay looked almost peaceful. The overhead lights were at 40%, casting the forest canopy approximation that Sulek had maintained since the first hour. The Grethari was lying on its side, breathing steadily, the biosynthetic patch on its flank reading green across all metrics. Merritt was sitting cross-legged beside the animal, reading something on a maintenance tablet. Soot was draped across the Grethari's forelimb, specifically across the massive manipulator claw that had sheared through the cargo net and could shear through hull plating sleeping. The claw was retracted. The Grethari's head was resting on the floor, its eyes half open, watching Merritt's tablet with the lazy interest of an animal that had nowhere to be and nothing to fear. Jorath stared. "That," he said, "is a human. A maintenance technician, Merritt Cohen, C-ring. And the small animal on her claw. Soot Earth domestic feline, a tabby cat. The cat is sleeping on a Grethari. The cat has been sleeping on or near the Grethari since she arrived. The Grethari's cortisol equivalent has dropped 86% since the initial intervention. Oxytocin analog is sustained at 340% of recorded maximum. The wound is healing. The immune hyperreaction has stabilized. The animal has not extended its claws in 18 hours. The Hask data analyst looked up from her tablet for the first time. 340% of recorded maximum. That figure cannot be correct. The single documented instance of elevated oxytocin in a Grethari was 9 seconds of pre-attack chemistry. This is sustained. 70+ hours and counting. I have the telemetry logs available for your review. The Hask scrolled to a new screen, compared numbers, scrolled again. Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence. The Hask equivalent of rechecking a calculation you already know is correct and wishing you'd gotten a different answer. The data supports the reading. Havo, the Gren containment specialist, leaned toward the window. He was twice Sulek's mass and had 40 years of high-risk megafauna management on 7 worlds. His face was doing something complicated. The literature says Grethari don't accept physical proximity from any species outside their own pack structure. The literature is 3 pages long and half of it is redacted. I've collected more data in 72 hours than the literature contains. How? By not trying to sedate it, dominate it, or contain it. By treating her like an animal in pain instead of a threat to be managed. And the cat? Sulek looked at the feed. Soot had shifted in his sleep, his body resettling against the Grethari's claw with a faintly audible purr. The Grethari's sensory spines pulsed once slowly, evenly, and its eyes drifted to the cat and held. The cat, Sulek said, is doing something that 14 years of xenoveterinary training did not prepare me to explain, and 20 minutes of direct observation forced me to accept. The Grethari recognizes the cat, not as prey, not as a territorial competitor, not as a threat, as kin. The neurochemical response to the cat's proximity matches the profile of intrapack bonding, the patterns that Grethari produce when they are in the presence of their own offspring. A cat, Joreth said. A cat from Earth, a deathworld, the same classification as Chelmvor. Sulek paused. She had thought about this in the quiet hours of the night, watching the telemetry, listening to the purring through the monitoring feed. The Grethari doesn't know what a cat is. But its biology recognizes what a cat is on a level deeper than cognition. Apex predator recognizes apex predator. Deathworld animal recognizes deathworld animal. The size difference is irrelevant. The species difference is irrelevant. What matters is the signal, calm, confident, unbothered, present. The cat broadcasts that signal the way a beacon broadcasts light. The Grethari's entire evolutionary architecture is wired to respond to it. Joreth was quiet for a long time. On the feed, Marit had set down her tablet and was running her hand along the Grethari's jaw ridge. The Grethari's eyes were closed. Its breathing was deep and even. Soot opened one eye, confirmed that nothing important was happening, and went back to sleep. The committee's position, Joreth said, is that the Grethari represents an uncontainable liability. The preliminary recommendation is euthanasia. The committee's position is based on 3 pages of literature, 2 failed studies, and 0 direct treatment data. I have 72 hours of continuous telemetry showing a Class 9 predator responding to non-invasive, non-chemical behavioral intervention with the most stable vital readings ever recorded for the species. The animal is healing. The animal is calm. The animal is demonstrating social bonding, behaviors that the committee's own registry says are impossible. Impossible is a strong word. So is euthanasia. Joreth looked at the feed one more time. On the screen, Marit had leaned against the Grethari's flank and closed her eyes. The Grethari's tail had moved the slow, heavy curl and wrapped around the human's waist, not restraining, holding, the way you hold something you've decided belongs to you. I'll need your report by station evening, Joreth said. He left. Havo stayed. The Gren containment specialist stood at the observation window for 20 minutes without speaking. Sulek let him. She recognized what was happening behind his eyes, the reorganization of a career's worth of assumptions against the evidence of a cat sleeping on a monster's claw. The human, Havo said finally, she's not afraid. No. Why not? She grew up on a farm. She had a cow that kicked. She put her hand on the cow's shoulder and it stopped kicking. She put her hand on a Grethari's foreleg and it stopped dying. She doesn't see the classification or the threat rating or the 3 pages of redacted literature. She sees an animal that needs to know someone's there. And that's enough. Sulek thought about it. She thought about the 47 minutes she had worked inside the Grethari's wound while a cat purred, and a human talked about nothing in a voice that sounded like a kitchen and a morning, and a hand on a fence post. She thought about the fever at 300, and the claws retracting millimeter by millimeter while a human said, "I know it hurts. Stay with me." She thought about the tail wrapping around Merritt's waist like a question answered before it was asked. "It's more than enough," Sulek said. "It's the only thing that works." Havo left on the evening shuttle. He did not file a containment recommendation. He filed a request to observe. That night, Sulek found Merritt in the station canteen, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug she'd brought from her quarters. Soot was asleep on the table beside the mug. The canteen was empty. The staff had learned to avoid mealtimes when the human and her cat were present, not out of hostility, but out of a discomfort that Sulek recognized as the uneasy awareness that something fundamental about the universe had shifted, and they didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. "The committee will make their decision within the week," Sulek said, sitting across from her. Merritt nodded. She didn't ask what the options were, she knew. "You should understand," Sulek said carefully, "that what you've done is unprecedented. The Concord's entire framework for managing apex predators is built on the assumption that dangerous animals must be controlled through chemical, physical, or behavioral dominance. You've demonstrated that a Class 9 predator will voluntarily cooperate with its own treatment if the conditions are right. That undermines 60 years of published methodology." "I didn't demonstrate anything, I just sat with her." "That's exactly what undermines it." Merritt looked at Soot. The cat was dreaming, paws twitching, ears flicking, chasing something in a world that only he could see. People make animals complicated because they're scared of them. Animals aren't complicated. They're honest. They tell you what they need if you stop long enough to listen. The Concord doesn't listen. It categorizes. "I know, that's why she was dying when she got here." Sulek had nothing to add. She sat with the human and drank her own thermal broth and watched Soot chase dreams on the table, and she understood that she was in the presence of something her training had never addressed. A way of being with animals so old and so fundamental that the galaxy's most advanced xenobiological framework had never thought to include it. The Grethari healed in 11 days. By day 4, the wound showed clean granulation tissue under the biosynthetic patch. Sulek documented the progress with the meticulous care of someone who understood that she was writing the first clinical record of successful Grethari treatment in the Concord's history, and that every detail would be scrutinized by committees and researchers for decades. By day 5, the Grethari began eating, not the synthesized paste that the station's feeding protocols prescribed. Merritt had spoken to the galley staff directly, and they had produced something closer to raw, unprocessed protein from the station's cellular stock reserves. The Grethari ate all of it. Then it looked at Merritt and produced the low vibration that Sulek had learned to recognize as satisfaction. Merritt had called it the happy noise. Sulek had documented it as postprandial vocalization indicating metabolic contentment. They were describing the same thing. By day 6, the dermal plating at the wound margins had begun regenerating, a process the literature described as theoretically possible but never observed in a living specimen. Sulek ran the scan 3 times. The plating was growing back. Not scar tissue, not a biological patch, actual dermal armor, indistinguishable from the original, produced at a rate that exceeded the theoretical maximum by a factor of 2. She added a note to the report. Recovery rate correlates with sustained elevated oxytocin analog. The bonding chemistry appears to accelerate healing. Mechanism unknown. By day 8, the Grethari was standing, walking the length of the triage bay in slow circuits that Sulek monitored from the observation station, and Merritt walked beside, Soot riding on the Grethari's back like a passenger on a slow train. The station staff who had pressed against walls and hidden behind equipment carts on day 1 now found reasons to walk past the observation window. Some of them lingered. None of them said anything, But Sulek noticed that the expressions had changed from terror to curiosity, from curiosity to something that, if she were being unscientific about it, she would have called wonder. On day 9, the Grethari did something the telemetry didn't explain. Soot had been sleeping on the Grethari's shoulder when he woke, stretched, and jumped to the floor to investigate a maintenance panel that was humming at a frequency only he found interesting. The Grethari watched him go. Its sensory spines tracked him across the bay, every step, every pause, every whisker twitch as Soot inspected the panel and found it wanting. When Soot returned and jumped back onto the Grethari's shoulder, the animal produced a sound that Sulek had never heard from any species in her career. Low, sustained harmonic. Not pain, not communication in any registry-documented sense. A vibration that came from the Grethari's chest cavity and resonated through its armor plating, and traveled through the floor and hummed in the walls and sounded, if Sulek allowed herself the unscientific indulgence, like something very large and very ancient trying to purr back. Keth looked at Sulek from the monitoring station. Sulek looked at the telemetry. The Grethari's oxytocin analog had spiked to 400% of recorded maximum. Did it just? Keth started. Yes. Can they do that? Apparently they can, added to the report. Soot, for his part, gave no indication that he found this remarkable. He had settled back into his spot against the Grethari's neck and was already asleep. The purrback continued, low and steady, for another 40 minutes. When it stopped, the Grethari was asleep too. By day 11, the wound was closed. Sulek ran the final scan herself. The tissue was clean, the plating intact, the inflammatory markers at baseline. The Grethari's cardiovascular output was strong, its neurological function nominal, its immune system, the catastrophic overreaction that had nearly killed it, running at a stable, regulated hum that Sulek's instruments described as optimal, and Sulek herself described as remarkable. The Grethari was ready to leave. The question was where. Jorath's report to the committee had recommended continued observation rather than euthanasia, a recommendation that Sulek knew was driven less by her data, and more by the fact that Jorath had watched a cat sleep on a monster and couldn't quite bring himself to order the monster killed afterward. The committee had accepted the recommendation with the stipulation that the Grethari be transferred to a long-term containment facility on Velun's surface. Sulek had read the facility specifications: concrete enclosure, reinforced walls, feeding protocols based on synthesized nutritional paste, climate control set for Concord standard comfort, monitoring via remote camera. No forest canopy, no running water, no cat. She found Merritt in the triage bay at 600, sitting with her back against the Grethari's shoulder while Soot slept in her lap. The Grethari was dozing, its sensory spines pulsing in the slow contentment rhythm that Sulek had come to think of as Soot's frequency, the pattern the animal produced only when the cat was present. The committee wants to transfer her, Sulek said. Merritt didn't look up. Where? Surface facility, long-term containment. What kind of containment? Sulek told her. Merritt listened. Her hand rested on Soot's back, her fingers moving in the slow, automatic stroke of someone who has petted the same cat for 4 years and no longer thinks about the motion. She'll die, Merritt said, not dramatic, not pleading. A technical assessment, delivered in the flat voice of someone who fixes conduit junctions and understands what happens when you remove a component from the system that keeps it running. You take her away from everything she's bonded to: the lights, the water sound, the temperature, Soot, the routine, and she'll go right back to where she was when she hit the bay doors. Except this time she won't have anywhere to crash into. Sulek knew this. She had known it since she read the facility specifications. She had been waiting for someone to say it out loud so she could stop pretending the decision was difficult. I'm going to recommend that the Grethari remain at the station, Sulek said, under my medical supervision. with environmental conditions maintained to current specifications. And soot. Soot is a medically necessary component of the patient's treatment plan. Merritt looked at her. For the first time, something crossed the human's face that wasn't calm or flat or unremarkable. It was gratitude, and it lasted 1 second, and then it was gone, and she was back to being a maintenance technician petting a cat. "I'll need to adjust my shift schedule." "We'll accommodate that." Sulek turned to leave, then stopped. Something had been building in her for 11 days, a question she hadn't known how to ask because she hadn't known how to frame it in any language her training had given her. "Ms. Cohen." Merritt. When you walked into the triage bay that first day, the coolant leak, bay 4, and you saw the Grethari on the floor, 800 kilograms, bleeding, claws extended, sensory spines active, your cat jumped down and walked toward it. You didn't stop him. You didn't reach for him. You didn't move. "I know." "Why?" Merritt was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved on Soot's back in the same slow, automatic rhythm, because he knew what he was doing. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've watched him for 4 years. I've watched him walk toward dogs 3 times his size in the loading bay and sit down next to them until they stopped barking. I've watched him climb into the lap of a DVN engineer who hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 weeks and just sit there until the engineer started talking again. I've watched him find the one person in a room who was hurting and go to them, every time without being asked, without being trained, without any reason that anyone could explain." She looked at Sulek directly for the first time. "He doesn't do it because he's trained. He does it because he's a cat. And cats are very good at knowing who needs company." "That is not a veterinary explanation." "No," Merritt said, "it's better than one." Sulek filed the recommendation that afternoon. She titled it Sustained Behavioral Integration Protocol for Grethari Specimen V1, Non-Chemical, Presence-Based Framework. It was 47 pages long. It contained 11 days of telemetry data, comparative analyses across 14 species trauma recovery frameworks, and detailed documentation of every interaction between the Grethari, the human, and the cat. The final paragraph read, "The patient's recovery is attributable to 3 factors operating in concert: appropriate environmental modification to approximate the species' native habitat conditions, non-invasive veterinary intervention guided by real-time telemetry rather than literature-derived protocols, and the sustained presence of a human civilian and an earth domestic feline. The latter 2 factors, the human and the cat, are inseparable from the treatment outcome. The human's behavioral approach eliminated threat signaling and established trust through consistent, undemanding physical presence. The cat's proximity triggered a neurochemical bonding response that the patient's evolutionary architecture recognized as pack signaling, despite the absence of any taxonomic relationship between the species. Together, they created the conditions under which a Class 9 apex predator chose to accept help. This choice, the patient's voluntary cooperation with its own treatment, is the foundation of the recovery and cannot be replicated by any chemical, mechanical, or behavioral conditioning method currently available in the Concord's medical framework. The protocol's operative mechanism is trust. It cannot be synthesized, prescribed, or administered. It can only be offered and accepted. The committee approved the recommendation 3 days later. The vote was 4-1. The dissenting member, a HASC administrative adjudicator, filed a minority opinion noting that the protocol was built on variables that cannot be replicated, standardized, or scaled, and that approving it set a precedent that the Concord's xenobiological framework is not equipped to manage. Sulek read the minority opinion and agreed with every word. A woman and a cat and the particular quality of presence they carried together was not something you could write into a manual. That was the point. That was the entire point, and the fact that a HASC adjudicator had identified it as a weakness was the clearest demonstration Sulek had ever seen that the Concord's approach to dangerous animals had never been tested against the simplest question. What if the animal doesn't want to be managed? What if it wants to be trusted? Soot slept through the notification. The Grethari's permanent quarters were built on C-ring, adjacent to Marit's maintenance section. Sulek oversaw the design herself, forest canopy lighting with a natural dark cycle, running water fed from the station's primary reservoir, ambient temperature calibrated to Chelmsford averages, and a connected access corridor to Marit's quarters that could be opened from either side. The architects protested the corridor. Sulek attached her 47-page report to the work order. They built it. On the day the Grethari was moved from the triage bay to her permanent quarters, Marit walked beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. Soot rode on the Grethari's back, wedged between two armor plates, purring. The Grethari walked the station corridor at a pace that matched Marit's stride, 800 kilograms of Class 9 apex predator, adjusting its gait to accommodate a 62-kilogram human in a maintenance jumpsuit. And the station staff pressed against the walls and watched in a silence that Sulek would later describe in her personal log as the sound of a paradigm failing to hold. The Grethari entered her quarters. She circled the space once, reading it with her sensory spines, sampling the water, testing the light, mapping the boundaries, and settled beside the water feature. Marit sat beside her. Soot jumped down from the Grethari's back, walked to the water feature, inspected it critically, drank from it, and then returned to his position against the Grethari's neck. The Grethari produced the low harmonic, the purrback. The sound filled the quarters and carried into the corridor and hummed through the wall into Marit's adjacent room and settled into the station's architecture like a frequency it had always been missing. Sulek stood in the doorway. She had spent 14 years in xenoveterinary medicine, and she had learned 100 things about animal behavior and biochemistry and trauma response and evolutionary adaptation. She had learned one thing in the last 11 days that outweighed all of them. The deadliest animal in her career had not been tamed. It had not been sedated, conditioned, restrained, or broken. It had been offered a hand and a presence and a small, purring animal that didn't care about threat classifications, and it had decided on its own, through its own biology, using circuits that no training had installed and no research had mapped, that these things meant safety. The word for that was older than medicine, older than the Concord, older than the species that built it. Marit had used it on the first night without thinking, the way you use a word you learned before you learned what learning was. Trust. Sulek closed the door gently, leaving the three of them inside. The Grethari's monitoring light held steady green. Soot's purr carried through the wall, small, steady, the sound of something ancient and simple and completely, immovably sufficient.